I just wanted to tell everyone thanks for taking the time to give some input into the climate change initiative. It's really important, I think, to figure out how best rural Utah can fit into the initiative. I think it's kind of a done deal that Extension is going to participate in some way, and I think it's up to us to direct how we best can fit and do the most good within rural Utah. Thanks, everybody.
Well, I think, well, that was well said, and I would just add my sort of introductory remarks on that. You know, as much as all of us, I'm sure, myself, I think at the top of the list would like, this topic of climate change is not going away, it's only going to get bigger. And as more and more people in our communities in Utah are asking questions and needing and wanting information, I think this decision that's been taken by Extension nationwide, and certainly here in the Southwest region, to join this effort, which is really to help all of Extension provide, basically provide Extension, the Extension professionals, agents and specialists and faculty, the information, the knowledge, and the tools that you need to provide the very best information and help to your communities as possible. So that's what this initiative is about. Again, Ken White has asked the Utah Climate Center to help with it. We've been doing quite a bit of climate change outreach in the past 7 or 8 years. So you kind of saw the introductory video that I made. That was based on a meeting we had back in May to try to quickly, briefly explain the initiative, sort of its origins, and also a very brief summary of the climate change motivation behind this. So let me say that I think the end game for this sort of first phase of this initiative, extension-wide, within Utah and outside of Utah, is really to get to a point where we can start to help our communities, our clientele, with vulnerability assessments, looking down the road and seeing the spread of projections of what may be coming, and start to think ahead as to how to get ready for that. And so this notion of a vulnerability assessment is I think kind of key to the whole initiative, and also the notion that these are sort of guided self-vulnerability assessments. So once people are working from good information, farming, ranching, water management, municipal management, power, et cetera, health, human health, transportation, all of these communities and demographics and clienteles, once they have good information, they're in probably the best positions to start figuring out for themselves how that's going to affect what it is they do, how their communities. And our job, hopefully, is to provide them with the tools and some guidance, because a lot of this work has been done elsewhere, and just put people in touch with the information they need. But of course, before Extension can do that, within Extension ourselves, we need to be, we ourselves need the very best information we can be working with. And so that's sort of the very first phase of this endeavor, is to get all of ourselves up to speed and thinking about, first understand the basic information, and then thinking about how best you can put it in front of your clientele. And so on that sense, I think the notion is certainly, in the meetings I've been in, understood that the agents in the communities are best equipped to assess how to put it in front of the people in their communities and their clientele. And so that's this first phase, is to help all of you, the agents, get the information and the tools you need to start thinking about how to do that. I think this is my impression of how Extension wants to run this. Certainly Ken in Utah is not a top-down, here's how you will do it, but very much about getting all of the agents to think about how best to do it and then just providing you what you need to do that. So with that introduction, maybe let me first just let me say we sent out these questionnaires. I got 2 questionnaires responses, and they were filled out with some very well articulated thoughts, both questions on the climate science and some thoughts about putting it in front of clientele. I'll come back to that in just a moment, and there were some common themes in the 2 questionnaires I got out, but let me just first say, before we go any further, if anyone out there has any questions that really jump to mind based on what I've said so far. Okay. Well, so the plan moving forward then is to roll out this initiative, continue to roll it out more broadly at the regional conferences in October, staff meetings, I guess is the terminology. And I'll ask for your patience up front. I'm not actually in extension and don't have a background in extension, so I'm still learning my way around the lingo. So the regional staff meetings will be bringing this up in October, and then I think there'll be a broader discussion after everyone's had time for this to percolate at the state conference, extension conference in the spring. So that's what this meeting here is about, is to start to get some discussion, particularly helpful for me in really how to best go forward within extension in starting to bring everyone up to a sort of the same base level from which we can move forward with information. So the idea will be to do a short presentation at the staff meetings, and I guess I wanted to quiz those of you who are here, really just about your thoughts about just your initial thoughts about this. And I don't think you have to be too self-conscious about it. First reactions, I think, are the most honest. Nothing.
Yeah, no, Robert, I think one of the issues that we need to probably address right up front is the nature of the science. Also, I think we need to define the difference between weather and climate. And as I was talking with some folks just a couple of days ago, they were saying, one of the problems with talking about presenting the science is that the language has changed enough so that people will automatically say, well, science can tell you anything you want it to tell you, and the ever popular, well, that's faulty science. And so dealing with those realities of the situation, I guess, how do we proceed coming from that background?
Sure. So maybe I'll use I think Christine, you may need to turn your microphone off. There we go. So maybe I'll just start with the flow of the questionnaires, the 2 that I got back, which were very helpful. Thank you, those of you who filled them out. I'll send some individual responses to those people, but what they put down were very much along the lines of what you were just saying, Christine. So the first question that I asked was simply, do you have any questions about climate change science? And I would certainly expect that there would be. And the video that we sent out certainly was not intended to be a comprehensive cover the topic comprehensively, simply to summarize the motives for this initiative. So one of the things that I'm planning to, well, what I'm in the process of doing and have done a fair amount so far, is to put out more bite-sized videos, in the sort of the 3 to 5 to 7 minute length range that address lots of the common questions. And so, for example, some of the questions articulated on the questionnaires were, what about water vapor as a greenhouse gas? How do we know what climates were like in the past? 500 years, 1,000 years, 10,000, hundreds of thousands of years ago. How do we, climate science says we know what the climates have been like in the past. How do we know that? And where does that information come from? How certain are we about the role of fossil fuels and human activity in the current climate change? There's the notion that climate changes. It's a kind of a common meme that one will often hear. Climate's always has changed and always will. So what's different this time? Why are we making such a fuss? So and the difference between weather and climate. There are lots of good questions on the science that most people, there's no reason that they would a priori know the answers to these things. They're good questions, and there are very good, straightforward answers to these that can be provided succinctly. So that's one of the tools we'll be providing from the Climate Center for all of Extension to look at. At the moment, they're intended primarily for the Extension agents and specialists, but certainly they're available to be presented to clientele as well. But initially, I think the first push here is just to get all of us in Extension to a position such that when the clientele, when our communities ask, we have good information to provide them. Moving on, I'll come back to the science in a moment, and just know that there will be a lot of tools for you to use on that front. There were also a number of comments about. So I asked, sorry, I'm just going to pull it up here. Are there specific climate change questions you'd like to see addressed in future videos? Yes, we just talked about that. And then what are your initial thoughts about the need to bring climate change to your programs and clientele, and what are your initial thoughts about the challenges? And a couple of the comments here I think were very good and certainly representative of what we heard in May when we had our initial meeting with a number of agents up here in Cache County. And that was, it's a politicized topic, and so it's uncomfortable to talk about. Certainly very true. There were two strong comments about the notion of doom and gloom, and how you don't want Extension to jump on the doom and gloom and destruction. I'm quoting now. I thought it was a particularly colorful phrase. Don't want to jump on the doom and gloom and destruction bandwagon. And I think this is a common conception of discussions about climate change. I would simply try to turn those comments on their heads as we move forward. I think it's important that we reorient our perspective on this. What we're presenting is good information on science. And if the science is alarming, all the more need to present it. I sometimes use the analogy that you're on the Titanic and the guy in the crow's nest yells iceberg, dead ahead. Are we going to call that doom and gloom and destruction, or are we going to call that an appropriate warning and risk management? And so you can look at it as doom and gloom if you want, and I can understand where that perspective comes from, because the information is compelling, it's frightening, but I will also say that sometimes alarm is the appropriate response, and that is the case with this information. The long and the short of it is, the current path that we are on with respect to climate change, and this is not me saying this is an enormous community of climate scientists that are in unanimous agreement on this, as best as one can assess scientific consensus, that the path we are on is extremely high risk for humans. And at the moment, we're showing few signs of getting off that path, although some signs. So we need to start getting our communities ready for this. There's also quite a bit of room for mitigation, which is good. And the sooner we get started on that, hopefully the less change we see and the less risk we face. But I want to replace the meme of doom, gloom, and destruction, or the sky is falling, with the meme of prudent risk management and preparation. That is, I think, is the appropriate mindset to move forward. And so we want to provide the best information we can on that. The information is alarming, and there's no getting around that. Sorry, let me just get back to my notes here. There were also quite a smattering of responses, well, consistent on the questionnaires I got back about energy and fossil fuels. I think this is interesting because at the moment we're really just talking about understanding the basic facts of the climate is changing. How do we know that? Humans are driving this change. How do we know that? But of course, as soon as you go to the notion of mitigation and how are humans driving this, the notion of fossil fuels and energy pop up. Now, I should say that it's not the only aspect of this topic, but it's certainly one of the biggest. And the science is very clear that if you want to mitigate the risk going forward, the biggest piece of that by far is moving away from fossil fuels, moving away from our carbon emissions into the atmosphere. That is simply a scientific reality. Of course, the policy paths of getting there are many and varied, and those debates need to happen and are happening in our society. What's not happening at the moment within our communities is those debates are not happening in an intellectually honest fashion. That is to say, a lot of the debate is being deflected towards, well, gee, is the climate really changing, and do humans have anything to do with this? Those questions are answered quite definitively in the science. And so having the debate is a very good thing about what to do about it, but it needs to happen in an intellectually honest fashion based on the science. And the notion is if you went to a county council meeting and you were discussing putting a guardrail on a mountain road, there would be lots of thoughts about that. Some people might say it was going to cost too much. Other people would say it's a good investment. Some people might say, well, speed limit signs are a better thing to do. Some people might say streetlights are a better thing to do. But no one would argue that you don't need the guardrail because we're not really sure if you drive off the road if you'd fall into the ravine. In other words, we're all agreed that if you drive off the road, you're going to go down the ravine. Nobody debates gravity. And that's not quite the place we're at yet in this discussion on a policy level. So I think the more we get our communities up to that level so that we're not really debating gravity anymore, but working off just straight science and saying, okay, here's what happens if you drive off the road. Now let's talk about how not to do that. And there are many and varied discussions to have there. That's not really the focus of this initiative. The focus of this initiative is just to get people working from good information. So the details of the policy debates at this point are not the focus of this initiative. Both people in the questionnaires raised the following question. They said that the video that they looked at seemed one-sided towards the negative. And are there any positives about climate change? And it's a complex question. Depends on who you're talking about, where you're talking about, and when you're talking about. But I think the overarching answer is on the path we're on in the long term. So as we look, let's say, 3 to 6 to 9 decades down the road, The short answer is essentially no. There are very few positives in the impacts that we can see, and there are huge negatives. In the shorter terms, let's say in the next 1 to 2 decades, yeah, there might be some things that people regard as positive. So somebody brought up the notion of a longer growing season in portions of Utah. In the next couple of decades, that's certainly possible that we'll see that. And around the globe, there are a number of places that may see that and probably will see that. But as you move beyond that, as you move beyond 2 decades to 3 to 6 to 9 decades, then the negatives start piling up. So one of the common sort of questions is, well, I thought carbon dioxide was good for plants. It enhances plant growth. And that is true differently for different plants. And if that's the only thing that you change, well, then maybe sure, that sounds good. But unfortunately, that's not the only thing you change. You're changing the whole climate. So I'm not sure that a longer growing season per se does us any good if we don't have the water for it, or if the invasive species are moving so fast that it changes your ability to grow particular crops, or if the temperature changes so much that you can no longer graze your cattle or raise the crops that you're all set up to raise. And that is certainly the analysis that comes out of the literature of the people who are really studying what impacts have we already seen, for example, on agriculture in different places, and how do we expect these to play out. We see there's very little potential for positive, although there is some in some places during shorter time periods, but an enormous amount of potential for negative. And the scale of negative runs quite a range and goes to the extreme, to catastrophic. So from a risk management standpoint, climate change is not a good story. Is not really something we should be hoping for. There are also the aspects of this that are global as opposed to regional. And this is why it's important for us to be having this discussion about global climate change rather than, say, regional drought. So if you've got a regional drought, the plan in the past has been to ride it out. It's just a cycle, and the climate system certainly does have cycles to it. The difference when you're talking about a global climate change is that while you're going through challenges, other people are going through challenges as well. So, for example, one of the scenarios that national security planners are looking at very, very seriously is the fact that if we maintain our current emissions path for the next several decades, the expected agricultural impact to central Mexico and Central America is really quite extreme. And so you start to look at national security questions in terms of migration. Europe is experiencing this right now with the Syrian civil war and any number of civil wars ongoing in Africa. Aspects of which can be traced directly to environmental problems. In the case of Syria, an extended 4-year drought that does have climate change fingerprints on it was an additional stressor in the 4 years leading up to a significant stressor in the 4 years leading up to the Civil War. And how that's played out over the last 4 years is now we have this enormous migration crisis going on throughout Europe. So I bring that up because it's an aspect of a global environmental problem that one doesn't think about if you're just thinking about, oh, well, we're going through a 5 or a 6 year dry period and we can ride it out. So these are aspects of the problems that we need to start to get our mind around, and how is that going to affect us here in Utah, farming in Utah, ranching in Utah, our communities, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just some aspects of impacts beyond which we normally think about in climate, because we're not used to thinking about it on a global scale. Another interesting point is as you move forward in Utah under moderate to high emissions paths, our available agricultural moisture goes down significantly. But if you look at, those are the projections that we have currently. But if you look at Arizona and Nevada, their available water goes down dramatically. And so again, the question is, maybe we can ride it out in Utah if it's really just a Great Basin problem. But what happens when, you know, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles are also experiencing extreme drought at the same time we're experiencing it, and it's prolonged? It starts to bring societal problems to light that we maybe normally wouldn't be worried about. And so these are the sort of risk management, vulnerability assessment scenarios that ultimately we'll need to start thinking about once we can all get on the same page with the information, with the science. So there's one more thing, I guess. Let me just break there for a moment and see if that stimulated any questions or any thoughts about moving forward on this.
This is Ron Patterson, Carbon County. It seems like, or at least my biggest resistance comes from, there is only one scientific point of view to talk about here, and we don't really get any information. I mean, the media and everybody's pouncing on this one point of view, but there are other scientists with the opposing opinions on what's going on here, but we don't get that. And so it's hard for me to make up my mind, because I'm getting force-fed this one area, and the other area, the other point of view is kind of, well, you don't need to hear that. And I take offense at that type of an approach.
Sure. Would you tell me your name again?
Ron Patterson, Carbon County.
Thanks, Ron. That's an excellent question and well articulated, and a very common viewpoint. So from my perspective as a physicist and climate scientist, the answer is that we have two things going on here. We have the science of climate change, and we have the public issue of climate change. From the perspective of the science, there is just the one view. The notion that the climate is changing and that humans are driving this to great risk is essentially established scientific fact. Now, does that mean that we understand every little aspect about the climate system? Absolutely not. Of course not. But the questions are, is the climate changing? Are humans driving it? And is this great risk to humans? Those actually have correct answers from a scientific standpoint. We have the data and the knowledge to answer that. The reason that it feels to you, I would postulate, because I spend a lot of time talking with people who articulate just what you did, is because of the public issue of climate change, which has been highly politicized. So what you get in the media, I would argue, is a highly unbalanced presentation. It's often presented as a debate between, well, here's a scientist who says that climate's changing and humans are driving it, and here's a scientist who says that it's not. And when you watch that on television, it looks like a 50-50 debate. The reality of it is every relevant scientific organization on the planet, and this is dozens and dozens of them, and I'll just mention the U.S. National Academies of Science as perhaps the single most prestigious of them, is very clear about this is the state of the science. With high confidence, very high scientific confidence, we can say the climate is changing, humans are driving it, and the risks are high. This is one of the pieces, the misconceptions that if we can overcome, the misconception that there is a great deal of debate on these points within the scientific community. If we can overcome that misconception, then it becomes much easier to talk about the science itself. So one of the videos I actually have looks at, well, how do you know that there's a scientific consensus? It's a fair question. You know, how does how does your average person who's not a scientist, who doesn't do science for a living, who doesn't have the time to spend researching this, how do they know that there's a scientific consensus? You certainly wouldn't know it from the media. And I have a short little 6-minute video that takes you through sort of a scientific study of the consensus itself. And so I'll put that out there for everyone to watch. But the short answer is that this is established science. And we want to get I want to help Extension to understand that. And then we can then help Extension's clientele. You all can then help your clientele understand that as well. And I think you'll find that a powerful tool as well. That said, let me add one more caveat. When I say that this is very high confidence and that this is established, high scientific consensus, does that mean that every last scientist agrees? Of course not. I find this interesting. I've been doing climate physics heavily for the last 10 years or so. But before that, I worked in something called quantum physics, and I've taught a lot of university physics courses, and every now and then, probably a couple times a year, I get an email from some physicist somewhere in the world. It's their new proof that Einstein was wrong about special relativity. And special relativity, among other things, is a piece of physics we now understand very well. And it tells us, among other things, that you can't travel faster than light. And some people just really don't want to believe that. We want to believe that we can get in a spaceship at some point, travel faster than light, and go to the stars. And what that tends to breed is kind of occasional but regular scientists trying to prove that relativity is wrong. And it's kind of amusing, but it's also a good instructional that in science, the power of science is it doesn't depend on any one scientist. There are always going to be scientists who don't accept the reigning understanding of nature. Nevertheless, the consensus arises not from a show of hands, it arises from the evidence itself. And the reason that we know special relativity is correct is because we've done so many experiments and made so many observations that verify the predictions of this theory, of this description of nature. And so for someone to say that it's not true is a little bit laughable, because when you do that with a well-established scientific result, you have to show why all these other results are not correct. And it becomes much more unlikely as the evidence builds for a particular conclusion. I can tell you that there are geologists out there who still don't believe in plate tectonics. Our understanding of the structure of Earth's mantle and the causes of earthquakes. Frankly, as scientists, some of us just aren't very good at what we do. Some of us get attached to our own pet theories, and we can't let go of it. Some of us have ideological barriers to accepting certain results. This is certainly the case in biological sciences and evolution, for example. Nevertheless, science goes forward based not on these few minority opinions, but based on the huge preponderance of evidence that comes out on a particular thing. So that is certainly the case with climate science. There are a very, very few climate scientists who do not accept these conclusions. But they are an extreme minority. So as we move forward, I'll try to provide you information that assuages that concern of yours. Does that help, Ron?
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how that works.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
This is Jeff in Nephi. One question, one thought that I had is, the people we deal with aren't scientists, they're not researchers. A lot of them, when we prepare information, they want just good basic information and then what they can do about it. My thoughts, working with Extension as long as I have, is if we're going to be involved with this, we will need basically some, not all the research reports and all the detailed information, but some simple, straightforward information that I think shows both sides. I agree with Ron. I think there's a whole other group out there that saying the sky is not falling. But we need information that's non-biased, that kind of shows both sides of it and the concerns. And then what can the average person do? Or the farmers we're working with or individuals. Because I look at it, when I first watched that video and I've heard about this, I'm going, how do you eat this elephant in one bite? You can't do it. So what can an individual person do in their lives, or what changes can we make that people would accept to try to help with this problem? So that's just some general thoughts that I've got.
Very good thoughts. Thank you. The notion of simple, clear information is a powerful one, and this is where I want you all to help me with that. So as I put out these tools, initially what they are is some of them are videos. As we move further along, we'll have projections. You can help us figure out what it is you want projections for. We have sort of the basic ones. There's precipitation and temperature. But there may be things that you start to recognize as this topic starts to percolate more in your mind and say, the following projection would be really helpful for me. This following data would be really helpful for me. And my job will be to help you get that, prepare that for you. With these videos, I actually have been doing public presentations of climate change for quite a while. Again, the video you watched was a very short summary. It's certainly not a comprehensive. So I feel like I've got a pretty good running start as to how to present information clearly and compellingly. That said, I can always use your input to say, when you say, this just wasn't clear, or you didn't sell me on this, and I think if you told me this, this, and this, that would help. That's what I want to hear from you guys, and I will be happy to do it that way. So we want to work together to get that to a clear, accurate presentation.
The other thing you need to keep in mind is the personal economics involved in this issue. It's not just the country's economics, it's personal. When we get out and we're working with individuals, it's personal economics that drive how they respond to whatever we give them. So economics has got to be a big part of that equation.
Okay, that's a good thought. I can tell you that a lot of work has been done on the economics of adapting and mitigating the climate change on all scales, from global to national to regional to very local. And so there are already quite a bit of information and tools on that. And then, of course, it has to be tailored. The economics of an agricultural community in Utah are going to be different than some of the agricultural communities in California. Here in Utah, we've also got, places like Price, Uinta Basin, whose economics are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, which is a strong emotional component of this discussion. And so it doesn't do any good to ignore that, but to pay attention to it. So I think that's a great comment. And as we move forward, when you can think of specific information, and extension agents can think of specific sort of economic information, we'll try to find people who can help with that. I do want to go back to the briefly the previous comment that was again about both sides. And so from my perspective, the discussion in the science is not about presenting both sides, but helping people understand that there are not two sides scientifically. There is not the scientific position that maybe this isn't happening and maybe it won't be as bad as we think and maybe humans have nothing to do with it. That is not a scientific side. It's like saying there are two sides to gravity. The people who say that when I let go of this, it's going to fall, and the people who say that it won't. There's not two sides. There's just what the science is saying. That said, I understand that there is a perception of that. And so one of the things we can do is to address lots of misconceptions. So for example, how do we know this is not just a regular climate cycle? How do we know this isn't just natural? It's a perfectly valid, understandable, reasonable question. The question has been, not surprisingly, heavily investigated by the climate science world, many thousands of researchers over many decades, and we have good answers to that. I can tell you quite definitively, show you quite compellingly and definitively and convincingly, I think, the evidence that says, here's how we know this is not a regular climate cycle. How do we know it's not the sun? And again, a perfectly good question, and it has a compelling, straightforward scientific answer. So from the standpoint of both sides, we can maybe address it from the standpoint of misconceptions and say, well, here's how we know these things are not correct. But the underlying, the final goal here is to get to a place where we understand that there are not two sides to this science. There's the science side and there's the non-science, and we're interested in the science. And I don't mean to imply that that should be obvious to all of you right now. If you're getting your information from the media on this, it certainly looks like there's two sides. And so our task over the coming months is to provide you with the information that helps you understand the reality. Any other comments as we?
Hi, this is Kevin Eaton down in Garfield County.
Hi, Kevin.
Hey, how's it going? One of the things that we try to do in extension is meet clientele's needs. And so they come to us with a question, or they come to us with a need and say, help us out with this. I'm just not seeing farmers or clientele coming in and saying, we need to know more about climate change and how to prevent it. It's not one of those topics that they're coming to us to answer. And so I guess my question is, or my comment is, how does this fit with extension, where it's more of we're going out and trying to force feed or trying to get this information out when they're not asking the question?
Sure.
Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Absolutely, that's very clear, and I think it's a great point. I would simply turn the question around. Well, I would answer it this way. You're not seeing the, I would say, you're not seeing the need, and I believe you, yet. I would say that this topic is only going to get bigger and more compelling, and at some point in the not too distant future, you're going to start seeing that, and the idea is to have you prepared for it. I would say that's probably the thinking behind it. The other question, though, I have is, and as I said, I don't have a background in extension. I've been trying to learn as much as I can recently, but my understanding is one of the origins of extension was, when it was created, say back in the 30s or 40s, was bringing information to the farming community that they didn't necessarily know that they needed. So soil conservation techniques, crop rotation techniques, and a number of the stories I've heard so far are people talking about how, agents talking about how, in the early days they really couldn't get the farmers and the ranchers themselves to pay attention to the science-based information that was coming out of the universities and coming out of the research, but where they had real good success was with the kids in the 4-H programs. And so when the kids then took over the farms later on, they were more receptive to that information that extension had been trying to provide. So I think there's maybe, if that history is roughly correct, I think there's a precedent there for extension being proactive about information that they do believe the clientele will need, even though they don't quite understand they need it just yet. I certainly don't mean to sound presumptuous or arrogant and say, I know what you need. I don't mean that at all. But with this information, I'm pretty sure that agricultural communities need a good understanding of the climate that's coming down the road for them in their communities, the very best that we understand about it, and we understand a lot about it. So I'm wondering if, from your position as an extension agent, if it's helpful for you to have this information in your back pocket when the need starts to arise. And also, I would say that we're not, absolutely the strategy here is not to force feed it to people. The idea, again, is to bring extension up to speed on this information. And then let you figure out how best, where you think it is needed in your programs for your clientele. So if you know, in the next year, Kevin, if you just say, I'm just not seeing a need for this anywhere, no one is requiring you, to my knowledge, from within Extension to make presentations, to provide people with this information. I think the idea is that the agents are being empowered, trusted by the administrative people in Extension to recognize when their clients need it, to recognize when it's a good thing to present to your communities, and to start doing that in the way that you think will be effective and useful. But you've got to have the information and understand it before you can do that.
I think you use the analogy of Extension going out and teaching about crops and soils and things like that, and doing demonstrations, and we can do that, and we can take farmers out in fields and on tours and see the results of the science in action. But with this climate change and man-made fossil fuels, we go out and say, okay, we're going to demonstrate, we're going to have all these farmers on this side of the valley use horses to farm. Everybody over here, we can't, there's no, whatever any individual farmer does is not going to demonstrate that there's changes to the climate. And so that's the big challenge that we have, is even if the United States completely cut their fossil fuels emissions to zero, I'm not sure we're going to see any kind of effect. And so I think that's why it's going to be hard for us to believe the science. And I mean, we've got to see some results, I guess. If we put in place some actions, we've got to see some results so that we can continue on and make changes or reduce fossil fuel use or whatever we have to do. I'm just thinking it's, people respond to needs, and if this climate change is such a huge issue, then we ought to be able to do something. But if we do something and it doesn't change the direction we're going, then what's the point of doing anything or even worrying about it?
Well, your point about this being a more abstract problem is well taken. It's not a scientific problem of the same nature in that sense. But I would ask if you've got farmers making plans as to how they're going to structure their operations going down the road, I'm guessing they would be interested in things like soil moisture projections, precipitation, snowpack projections, things like that. So that's kind of the product we have available to show people. I've shown those things to a lot of people, and they've had a pretty strong impact on a fair number of them. I guess this is one of those risks that we can see coming, and from the standpoint of extension, I think it's probably about getting our communities familiar with these risks and starting to do risk assessments. Where do I think my operation is going to be vulnerable as a result of what I'm seeing? So that's my short answer. It looks like we've just got a couple of minutes left before they cut us off. I think it's a great point, Kevin. I think my short answer right now is that this is really about risk management and getting people just looking at what's coming down the road. It's not going to improve your yield next year or the year after. It's really about longer term planning, sort of on a decadal scale. But the risks are so large, I can't imagine that Extension wants to be in the position of not having participated in preparing their communities for it from a risk management standpoint. So I guess that's the short answer. And how to do that is really what this whole exercise is about. I don't claim to know how to do that. This is where we need your thinking as someone who's been out there in the field doing it for a long time.
Well, I think that's what Extension has always done. I think that probably should be the forefront of our approach, is that we've always addressed change and helping people change to meet new markets, change to meet the new climate and adapt. And I think that's probably the direction that we need to focus on with this discussion and our clientele.
I think that's a great point, and I think that's certainly a big part of it. But I'm going to go back to my Titanic analogy. The Titanic that was good for nothing else is a fabulous disaster metaphor. And I think we don't want our reaction to helping the clients be adapting to change be running around the North Atlantic in our lifeboats picking up survivors. I think it needs to be I think part of that also needs to be in turning the ship, and so that the disaster isn't actually as bad as it could be. So because the consequences, the risks are so large here, I don't think we can just wait until catastrophe strikes and then try to pick up the pieces. I think there's a lot